think I'm gonna head over to the United States, fool. Heard there's good work over there, fool. Why do you sound like that, fool? Jess? Alright, look, I'm gonna be real, okay? I'm gonna come out and say it. I have not uploaded a video in this past year, okay? Alright, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, okay? Do you accept my apology? Fuck no. Hell no. What are you? Well, can you blame me? I've been playing games recently. I mean, come on, Don't Starve, Yume Nikki, Brawlhalla, those are classics. And yes, I even include Fortnite in that list. But out of all the games that I've been grinding for the past couple months, there's been one game that's definitely stood out to me. I've probably dumped over 1,000 hours total into this game, and it'll probably be the cause of my life crashing and burning in the future. Hearts of Iron 4. It's kind of like Call of Duty, where you can conquer the world and you can shoot players and you can do really cool fun stuff. It's open. I'm just kidding. It's actually not that kind of game at all. It's actually the exact opposite. You just sit down and you stare at a map for like 2 hours straight. No, I'm just kidding. What actually happens is you navigate a world map and use your pixels to attack other pixels, and once you outmaneuver their pixels, you need to capture their important pixels, and when you take enough of their pixels, you can officially make their pixels your pixels. It's not boring, I swear. But in terms of what's being delivered, I mean, we can all acknowledge it's pretty simple. So how can a game that's so simple offer so much lore? I'm not going to be talking about Hearts of Iron in this video, at least not directly anyway. I'm going to be talking about a pretty popular mod for this game called KAISERREICH. Let's take a trip together. It's 1915, about a year since the beginning of the most devastating armed conflict humanity had ever seen. Nations all throughout Europe were embittered in violence and famine, and world leaders from all around the globe would be faced with making difficult decisions, each with outcomes involving the deaths of countless innocent lives. Among these leaders was a man named Wilhelm II, a militaristic war hawk who made decisions based on impulse rather than rationale. And it was because of this impulse that got him into the precarious positions he'd historically put himself in. He was the infamous Kaiser in charge of the newly formed German Empire, controlling several territories across multiple continents. However, something within the emperor made him feel dissatisfied with the gains he already made. He had some considerable territories in Africa, but compared to everybody else, Germany got the short end of the stick. And the same goes for every other continent. Truth be told, Germany entered the game far too late and suffered considerably on the world stage because of it. But this answer didn't satisfy Wilhelm's taste for expansion, and rather than roll over and simply accept defeat, he chose what he believed to be the next best option: to challenge the United States and foster the creation of a new world order. By the second year of the war, Russian troops were facing heavy casualties, and Belgium, along with parts of northern France, were being overrun with swarms of German troops. However, the crown jewel that Wilhelm sought to gain was an entire ocean away. Previously, the German High Command drew plans for a potential war with the United States, consisting of naval sabotage, spy infiltration, and a full-scale invasion of the US mainland. But as time went on, they gradually saw it as a less and less viable option. However, at this point, circumstances were different. Even decades later, a ground invasion was still deemed a poor choice that would eventually backfire on them. So rather, they decided if they couldn't rule the continent, they'd rule the waves instead. Wilhelm ordered the German Navy to be on standby, ready to sink any ships the US may be using to transport supplies to their enemies. Any and all naval vessels were deployed, scattered across the Atlantic, with all men on deck, ready to pull the trigger. And eventually, a ship sailed into range, the USS Lusitania. All scopes were lined up, ready to take aim. All fingers were on the triggers, ready to open fire. And yet, whether it was out of pure nervousness, apprehensiveness, or poor communication, not a single shot would be fired. A deafening silence. And this silence would ring across the world as a clear indication that the German government would in no way attempt to provoke an American intervention into the Great War. And from that point forward, the course of history would change forever. The world is facing the worst economic turmoil in human history. People all over the world are losing their jobs. Food is getting harder to come by, and the value of money has dropped to almost nothing. This unprecedented level of economic depression was the result of a stock market crash in Berlin, Germany, the world's new leading economic powerhouse at the time. Mass overspending, mass accumulation of debt, and just plain stupidity over time began to build up, until chaos broke loose on February 3rd, 1936, known by many in this universe as Black Monday. Needless to say, this incident sparked mass panic across the globe, but none were hit quite as hard as the United States. Prior to Black Monday, Americans were already unhappy. The government was deadlocked, and the American economy was in shambles from its own stock market crash in New York in 1925. Herbert Hoover was elected president in 1928, promising to pick up the pieces and put the American economy back together. But that didn't happen, and the American people were only just beginning to scratch the surface of the lies and empty promises of the Hoover administration. Franklin D. Roosevelt, a relatively unknown figure in US national politics, died of polio in September of 1921. Roosevelt never becomes president in this timeline. No Roosevelt means no New Deal. No New Deal means the Great Depression would drag on for years to come. Top that off with the Black Monday stock market crash, and the American people went from unhappy to angry. Throughout this political crisis, the public knew that a change needed to be made, and so new parties began to emerge as alternatives to the two-party system that had long dominated American politics. But these parties were not your typical third-party movements. These parties were radical. Syndicalists on one side, nationalists on the other. The extreme left and the extreme right, not just becoming a part of the American political machine, but rather ingrained in it. Americans were now watching their two-party system fail to achieve what they promised to do. And as these new parties emerged, they caused an unprecedented number of people to turn their heads towards radicalism. Desperate times call for desperate measures, and those who are desperate do almost anything to keep afloat. The radicals spoke to the people and promised peace in their time, prosperity, and they promised a change not just in the economy, but a change in American society as a whole. As the people's chants for change grew louder, the measures they took to be heard grew far more extreme. Protests on the streets turned to riots in the big cities. Local strikes turned national, and radicals with disagreements turned to murder on the streets and political assassinations. The government, aware of the unfolding situation in the country, saw an eerie sight on the horizon: the potential for a second civil war. The Depression saw life for the average American citizen change forever. A nation which was once emerging as a new, powerful force on the world stage was now beginning to show cracks in its invincible facade. And this change in public perception would carry huge ramifications for the day-to-day lives of Americans. Getting a job during this time was just not possible, and because of the stock market crash, businesses lost money. Less money for businesses means less money to pay their workers, and the nation would experience devastating levels of unemployment across all 50 states. Adding insult to injury, a horrible drought would create mass crop failures, which affected large agricultural sectors of the country. Farmers could no longer make ends meet, only contributing to further layoffs and higher unemployment. A near quarter of the American labor force was considered unemployed, and those who were still employed would get their wages and hours cut hard to make up for businesses taking hits in revenue. This was actually common throughout the nation, with lots of companies downsizing as a result. And all this scarcity of both work and workers instilled desperation among many. Those who were able to make it through would only be able to do so off of scraps of food and money, penny pinching to get by. And those who couldn't were found on the streets, clinging to anything they could get their hands on. It was a very unforgiving period in American history, and a great suffering was experienced because of it. Men would travel across the country in search of work that they would often never find. And the times that they did, they hardly managed to receive even nickels at a time. Local soup kitchens were overcrowded with people desperate for any kind of meal they could get, and the kitchens would run out of food pretty often too. This change in the attitude of American society was a staunch difference compared to the optimism and enthusiasm of the early 20s. Schools, businesses, bars, and taverns. The writing on the wall was written clear as day. The public wanted change. People's faces showed misery and a discontent, yearning for their way of life that was slowly degrading day by day. Everyone could see it, and many would begin to question who was responsible for this change in their lives. All fingers would point to Herbert Hoover, the president who promised to relieve the people of the Depression. He was deemed weak and ineffective as a leader, not doing enough to protect the people. The public was in dire need of something different, a new face who could possibly lead the country out of this tumultuous time and into a new era of prosperity. And different regions around the nation were searching for someone who fit the description. The American South, for one, was already a poor region in the country. Prior to the Depression, the South built a reliance on agriculture to make a large sum of its money. Rice, cotton, and tobacco were all major cash crops in the region that were fundamental for the South's economic stability. By extension, sharecropping would be where most landowners get their income. But come the Depression, prices plummeted for all kinds of goods. Farmers and landowners simply couldn't make enough money off their produce, and so poverty would swiftly take over the South, even more than it already had. Industries in the region like coal, textile, and lumber would become vulnerable to complete collapse, and with no circulation of cash, Southerners were discouraged from working. The situation looked unsalvageable, and how or if the South would be able to recover would take a miracle. And this miracle went by the name Huey Pierce Long, the dictator of Louisiana. Huey Long has had one of the most contentious and controversial political careers in American history, reigning over his home state of Louisiana with an iron fist. He carried forth with him an ambitious campaign with ambitious promises, but he kept his underlying message simple and concise: to share the wealth and make every man a king. His politics would focus on helping the poor and deposing any elites who would take advantage of them in any way. However, his goals for reform were cut short when he was assassinated in 1935 by an armed assailant he'd previously associated with years prior. He led a fast-paced lifestyle filled with crime, power, and money, facilitating an almost mafia-like environment where he'd spend his time entangled with all sorts of legal businesses. Also, side note, but I feel like he would sound just like Peter Griffin. Like, I feel like if I didn't know what his voice sounded like, I feel like it would sound just like Peter Griffin. Fostering the creation of a large, profitable, and interconnected political machine. But many out there question what could have been had he lived to see his reforms come through. What possible branches of history would have arisen had he continued engaging in his controversial business deals? What would have happened had his political machine kept running? Well, in order to see what could have happened, we must first take a look at what already did. Beginning in 1893 on a rural farm, Huey Long was born in a small parish in Winfield, Louisiana, just one of 9 siblings raised in one of the poorest states in the American South. As a child, he witnessed the Southern struggle firsthand and became very familiar with the sense of desperation of the world around him. However, compared to other Southerners at the time, Huey Long and his family were luckier than most. His father was a farmer facing the crop market failure like many others, and his mother was a deeply religious housewife. Taken to the average 20th century conservative family traditions, the kids would attend church school, practice Bible study, and participate in Sunday Mass. However, his academic performance wasn't such a pretty picture. While he managed to pass through grade school and junior high, as he got older, his performance would start to dwindle, and he would not be able to graduate high school along with his peers. When the time for college registration rolled around, his family's finances left him with not enough money to cover the expenses, leaving him unable to attend. However, what he lacked in education, he more than made up for in charisma. Growing up in Louisiana, Long was all too familiar with the common farmer sentiment. He knew many of those around him weren't so lucky, and after constantly hearing all this talk of the world around him being unfair, greedy, and riddled with thieves, it began to be all he could think about. A young Huey Long would look at how all the lives of the average citizens were in the hands of politicians who weren't working in the best interest of the people, rather only themselves and their inner circles. But instead of turning his head away, never to look back, he peeked his head just a bit closer and saw the potential for a powerful tool he could use to change the lives of the South forever: politics.
It is our estimate that 4% of the American people own 85% of the wealth of America, and that over 70% of the people of America don't own enough to pay the debt that they owe. How many men ever went to a barbecue?
In 1924, Long would take his first big step and ran for the governorship of Louisiana. When election time rolled around and the people headed to the polls, the results were less than favorable. In other words, he lost. However, despite losing, his performance in this election was beyond what anyone could have expected. He managed to get around 31% of the primary vote, a very strong showing for his first major campaign, and Long was well aware of it. He decided to take his loss as a learning opportunity and was nothing but eager to get the chance to run for office again. This was just the beginning. Just 4 years later in 1928, Long ran again for the Louisiana governorship. But this time, he would take a much more constructive, calculated approach. He made it a goal to appeal to the Catholic voter bloc, which made up a large demographic of Southern voters. Men like Joseph E. Ransdell and Edwin Broussard, who were prominent local Catholic figures, would be found publicly praising him. He was even affiliated with Father Charles Coughlin, a known priest, radio host, and prominent anti-Semite. Oh God. He took the time to visit smaller, more rural towns that the competition didn't really visit too often, and he would make frequent radio appearances, addressing his supporters and speaking to the public. In debates, his tactics consisted of smothering his opponents with insults and quips. Think of a 1930s Trump, and that'll give you a good idea of how he handles conversations. And just like Trump, he was a master at sloganeering. It was around this time when he came up with his most infamously known slogan, "Every man a king, but no one wears a crown," a staple of his newly growing indulgence into populism. When the primary elections finally came, Long would sweep his competition, and in the general election, he would wipe the floor with over 96% of the vote. Huey Long would be elected 40th governor of Louisiana, and all eyes would turn to him, awaiting the first move of the Kingfish. Huey Long swiftly entered into office, and he had one clear goal in mind. He knew the power of public appearances, and he made it his mission to establish himself as the undisputed head of state. Once officially in power, he fired all members of his newly acquired cabinet he deemed to be corrupt, and replaced them all with his friends and family, replacing one government of cronies with another. Whether they'd be good cronies or not, the public would find out in due time. But for now, Long's plan was beginning to set into motion, and his focus began to shift into gaining momentum. Long would try to use his first year in office to fulfill some of the campaign promises he made on passing legislation, and he would deliver on these promises very successfully. It was almost abnormal in the way he was able to get the legislature through the House and Senate, almost like he had the magic touch. However, it starts to make a lot more sense when you look at the tactics he used to get his way, some of which included bullying political opponents who disagreed with him and publicly humiliating them under the spotlight. Long also made sure to personally oversee the legislative processes for whatever law or bill he was trying to pass, and would even take matters into his own hands, pulling the trigger without full approval from either of the state bodies. But for Huey Long, this was a necessary evil that he needed to do for the good of the people, and as long as no one was looking, he could continue doing this as long as he pleased. That was until he attempted to pass a particular tax on gas. This tax would mainly affect the Standard Oil Company of Louisiana, which at the time was one of the largest oil distribution centers in the world. This tax would charge 5 cents per barrel of oil sold, around 90 cents in today's time, and Long claimed that it would serve as a sort of payment that Standard Oil owed to the state for allowing them to operate. This type of legislature isn't exactly new to the political scene. It's been done many times before, and it would normally seem insignificant in the grand scheme of things. But in reality, the can of worms that this situation would open would put Huey Long's reputation on the line. Standard Oil decided to fight back against Long, attempting to galvanize support against the tax to make it die before it even reached the Senate. Reportedly, Standard Oil even offered $20,000 for each legislator who voted against it, a hefty bribe that likely several lawmakers took. When the time came for the House and Senate to make their decision, it came out to be a no. The legislators refused to pass it, and to say that Long was upset would be an understatement. In truth, he was furious, and he made it well known not only to his posse of supporters, but also to the state bodies of Louisiana. Long publicly accused legislators from both the House and Senate of being bought, and accused them of colluding together to cheat the Louisiana people in exchange for money. And to be honest, he was probably right. Long hurled insults, accusations, and would attempt to ruin the reputation of anyone who he thought had anything to do with the failure of the bill. Many senators and House representatives were already growing wary of Long's undisputed iron fist way of managing the state, but the unfolding of this situation gave way for people to finally voice their concerns in a courtroom. In 1929, the Louisiana House called for the impeachment of Huey Long, citing 19 counts of gubernatorial misconduct. The charges ranged from accusations of blasphemy to bribery to the illicit misuse of state funds. Other allegations included carrying a concealed weapon, demolishing the previous governor's mansion without legislative authorization, and attending a drunken party where a stripper was present. The man in charge of the prosecution for this case was Cecil Morgan, a 30-year-old freshman representative who later became general counsel of Standard Oil, and he essentially became the voice for any and all of Long's political opponents who wished to see him removed from office. However, the most dire of allegations thrown against Long was the accusation of him trying to get one of his bodyguards to kill an opposing state representative. The trial was down to the wire, and had circumstances been just slightly different, Long would have likely been impeached and prosecuted. However, behind the scenes of the trial, Long had spoken to several state senators and struck an agreement with them. The agreement would be for them to sign a document declaring the trial to be illegal in exchange for guaranteed positions in the government, needing signatures from at least 1/3 of the Senate to be approved. And after only a short time, Long presented the judge with a document consisting of 15 signatures of the 39 senators, more than enough necessary to halt the proceedings. Long only barely managed to skirt away from a life behind bars, but the sudden conclusion of this trial left a lasting impact on the type of leader Long would become. There is no denying that Long outwitted the prosecution of the case, whether it be through sheer luck or outright skill. But the same can't be said about public reception. The people knew what the truth was. The trial was abruptly ended to intentionally obstruct a court proceeding. But for Long, it didn't really matter whether they loathed him or loved him. He was their governor now, whether they liked it or not, and the results of this case cemented his power as the kingfish of Louisiana. When the dust settled, Long would continue his duties in office, and would continue engaging in his illicit activities. One would think that the outcome of this trial would scare him into being on his best behavior, but this was not the case. In fact, it seemed like it only ramped up over time. Many in the state's office got their positions directly as a result of Long, and he was now ready to put these connections to work. He built a system in which state officials paid him 10% of their salary to keep their positions, and he would deposit these funds into a personal balance account. A large percentage of this money would be pocketed by Long and his family, but the rest of it was used to fund his public projects. One of these projects was for roads and infrastructure. He would greenlight the creation of one of the largest road building initiatives the state had ever seen, employing a hefty 22,000 men into the project and the workforce, a major boost to the state's economy. Long also made it a point to improve literacy in the poor population, claiming that everyone deserved a basic education. Public schools were built all throughout local communities, providing free textbooks and bus rides for all students. Even the healthcare system received better funding. And Long would end up creating his own newspaper called the Louisiana Progress to battle against his opposition on his own platform. The guy was literally breaking the law, but also kinda helping the people while doing it. The question the public were asking themselves now was, can I look past it? An overwhelming amount answered yes, and Huey Long's support would grow to unprecedented levels. In only a few short years, he would see himself in control of the most powerful political machine in the country, and the shockwaves of his administration would begin to receive national attention, including the attention of Jack Reed. Jack was a very eccentric person, to say the least. Born in 1887 to a well-off family living in a mansion, his upbringing was a very different one from that of most people of the time, especially considering who he would grow up to become. He's been called the hero of the labor force, the man who saved the people, even a socialist playboy. But most people know him as the all-American worker. But how did Reed evolve to become this big-shot leader for the Socialist Party of America? Well, growing up in a financially wealthy household, Reed was certainly better off than most. However, his health was a different story. As a youngin', Reed's grandparents took note of his feeble health and unfortunate tendency to get ill often. He would find himself surrounded by nurses and servants, tending to his ailments and illnesses constantly. Reed's mother would take responsibility for his social circle, carefully selecting his playmates and keeping it relatively small. It seems reasonable to assume that someone in this position would grow exhausted very quickly. But for a young Jack Reed, this was a prison. He would constantly hope for a taste of agency, the free will to get to make his own decisions where he would get to call the shots in his life. But all that he was left with was a sick, bedridden lifestyle with hardly any personal connections, and no amount of wealth would be able to remedy that. This was torture. When the time came to attend school, Jack pounced at the opportunity to finally be set free from the confines of his room's walls. But entering the education field, his academic performance was not the best. He wouldn't really pass with flying colors as much as he would just pass by them, getting lackluster grades for most of his academic career. As time went on, he came to find school boring and tedious to go to, and he would begin to falter on his assignments. One thing he wouldn't find boring, though, were the extracurriculars. When the time came for college, Jack would enroll into Harvard as per request of his father, who wanted all of his sons to attend. While failing to pass the exam on his first try, Reed would manage to pass in his second try and would be officially enrolled into Harvard in 1906. He would end up joining a wide array of after-school activities, such as swimming, water polo, theatrical clubs, and even cheerleading, just to name a few. However, while Jack's interests revolved around things that weren't so academic, there was one aspect of school that he truly came to love, and that was writing. Reed would get the chance to serve in the editorial boards of the Harvard Lampoon and the Harvard Monthly. He would write his own plays and music, and in his senior year of college, he would be named the Ivy Orator and Ivy Poet, some of the most popular and sought-after roles in Harvard's academic society. Walter Lippmann, one of the most influential writers in recent history, and considered by many as the father of modern journalism, attended Harvard at the same time as Jack Reed, and actually invited him to attend a meeting with Harvard's Socialist Club. Reed would end up attending these meetings multiple times. However, he would never actually join. But what Jack managed to extrapolate from the meetings was a revelation. The system as it is now is completely broken. All this made no ostensible difference in the look of Harvard society, and probably the clubmen and the athletes, who represented us to the world, never even heard of it. But it made me and many others realize that there was something going on in the dull outside world more thrilling than college activities, and it turned our attention to the writings of men like H.G. Wells and Graham Wallas. The Socialist Club would go on to criticize Harvard for not adequately paying wages to their faculty, and would distribute pamphlets and propaganda pieces, delivering arranged speeches around the campus about establishing a course on socialism to educate the student body about the plight of the working class. And Reed's fervor for leftism began to grow ever more. His knack for writing eventually grew into a passion for journalism, and after graduating in 1910, he would traverse the geopolitical minefield of Europe to get a proper view of what was really going on in the world. Europe in the early 20th century was a very tense and unstable time for the continent. In the centuries before, war was viewed a lot more favorably than it is in the present. It was seen a lot more like a sport to conquer lands and bring honor to their respective countries than real people losing real lives. But at this point in history, everything felt different. The turn of the 20th century would mark a change in warfare forever. Deadlier guns, deadlier artillery, deadlier everything. And worst of all, it brought a change in the attitudes of civilians and leadership alike, wondering what benefits war would truly bring for their people. Everyone could feel a change in the air, but none were prepared for the storm that would be soon to come. Reed would spend 6 months in Europe, traveling to Spain, France, and crossing the English Channel to reach the United Kingdom. He would pay off his trip by doing menial labor across the countries he would visit, speaking to the people along the way and getting acquainted with some of their personal lives. And as he spoke with more people, he started to notice a pattern of simmering discontent in the attitudes of the working class. Reed began to realize that there were a lot more people out there who had their own feelings about the systems they were a part of. And these people, just like him, wanted something to change. The question he would have to ask himself now is, would everyone go as far as he would? After returning from a short stay in Europe, he settled into a residence in New York City, eager to begin his career in journalism. Lincoln Stevens, one of Reed's acquaintances from Harvard, helped him land an entry-level position in the American magazine. His goal was to establish himself as a freelance writer, and he would use all available resources he had in his power to put his work out there. He wrote poems, read and edited manuscripts, and even published stories and an essay documenting his trip to Europe. Within a year's time, Reed would start to get the attention of bigger and more established publications, such as Collier's, The Forum, and The Century magazine. It was also around this time when Jack's interest in politics really began to spike. He would be influenced by his associates Lincoln Stevens and Ida Tarbell, but his positions and overall political slant were far more left than any of them were comfortable admitting. 2 years later, in 1913, Reed would leave his previous position to join a new rising publication called The Masses. The Masses was a socialist-leaning magazine publication focused on teaching and spreading the word of the exploitation of the working class and the general socialist agenda. Reed was a very prominent contributor, publishing over 50 pieces of work ranging from articles, essays, reports, and reviews, espousing their, or now his, political agenda. Unfortunately for Reed, this year would also mark the beginning of his extensive criminal history, facing multiple arrests for inciting riots among strikers and causing public disarray. However, these arrests would only serve to further radicalize him. Reed pledged his support for the industrial workers of the world, a steadily growing labor union in the States, and he would grant further support for the union's cause by favorably reporting on the New Jersey strikes in Paterson. By this point, Jack Reed had established himself as an ally of the workers and the movement of socialism across the world. And he was nothing more than gleeful when a new position for the Metropolitan magazine offered him a trip to report on the outbreak of the Mexican Revolution. Jack had spent a short time in Mexico, traversing the country as an on-the-ground reporter, capturing its pivotal battles and writing about the ever-changing political climate caused by the revolution. Many different camps and political parties were vying for power over the at-the-time government in Mexico. However, Reed seemed to grow a fondness for a specific group, the Villistas, a radical socialist group under the leadership of Mexican General Pancho Villa. Reed would get very close to Villa and his small circle of revolutionaries, involving himself with Villa's constitutional army, El División del Norte. Many of the soldiers, or soldados, who participated in Mexico's revolutionary struggle viewed Reed as one of them, referring to him as Amigazo Juan or Juanito. But those who weren't so fond of him referred to him as El Gringo Loco, or in English, the crazy white guy. But those who did like him liked him a lot. Reed managed to build a lot of connections with the soldiers and common folk, and after just a short conversation with them, they would always express to him the same sentiment: exhaustion. The people were tired of having to fight. Constantly they would battle with the Mexican government over land, workers' rights, and their own basic liberties, and all they asked for was to be left alone to their own devices. One revolutionary general, Thomas Urbina, told Reed in an interview that the government should be run by the men, not the rich. And when all is said and done, all revolutions throughout history have come down to one central idea: the rich versus the poor. The wake of the revolution raised a lot of concerns for surrounding nations, specifically the United States. The federal government was well aware of what was going on past the southern border, and they were concerned that if they were to let the revolution persist, eventually they'd succeed and spread their ideology north. To prevent this, the United States initiated 2 invasions into Mexican soil. the most infamous of which being the invasion and occupation of the city of Veracruz. The American intervention in the Mexican Revolution was seen by the civilian population as an outrage, a ploy to save their own skin by saving another. Unsurprisingly, Jack Reed viewed the intervention with resentment, but eventually the time came for Reed to return from his trip, and the outcome of the revolution would be left unanswered. However, even after arriving home from a 4-month trip, he couldn't stop thinking about what he saw. The differing groups, the people living among them, the lives they led. What did it all mean? But truth be told, Jack's mind was consumed by one thing and one thing only: revolution. Well, I voted. Who cares? Let's just hope everyone uses their fucking brain. Anyways, let's see what's on TV.
Workers of the world, hear me roar. I need you guys to go out there and vote. You need to go out there and vote right now. Do you hear me? Workers, vote for Jack Reed, November 3rd, 1936. Today is the day you bring the revolution to America. Do you hear me? This might be our last chance. Don't fuck this up. And I kid you not, I promise, this is not a threat, it's a promise. If we do not win this election, the streets will soak red with the blood of capitalists. And I'm gonna smell it and lick it all. It smells like plasma and red blood cells.
All right, get the fuck out of here. Next.
Well, you see, the way I look at it is that these parties are a bunch of shit. These parties are a pile of ass. What are the parties now? Democrats and Republicans. That's what I call them, because they can't do none, and they crap. They're crapola. They crap all over the place, a pile of shit. When's the last time you seen a Democrat or Republican do something good for this nation? You don't. All they do is shit all over and fuck over America and stuff. I bet if you were to ask them the same question, they couldn't tell left from right, up from down, right from wrong, penis from pussy. They couldn't tell. They're deficient. Sir, my question was about what your plans are for battling climate change. Oh. Well, I'll say this. America, do the right thing this election and vote for America first. Vote for Huey Long. Vote for the South. Vote for Sister Fucker. You know what to do. It's all correct. It's all right over here. Sir, what are you talking about? You know what? I don't know. But I do know this. Vote America first. Thank you very much.
Oof, yikes. We'll let this guy have a mic. All right, next. I'm sick and tired of pseudo-intellectuals trying to be something that they're not. Jack and Huey Long are perfect examples of this. They're both frauds who talk big, but in reality are small and insignificant people. Don't let their bombastic personalities and confident voices when they're giving speeches take away from the kinds of people they are. Don't believe me? Look at the destruction of the past 4 years since the last election. What have we seen? Riots, murder, arson, destruction of property, and the creation of multiple militia groups? How can these people claim to be the bringers of peace? My business was destroyed by a syndicalist militia on the New Year's strikes. Trust me, I am speaking from experience. Democrats, Republicans, and farmer laborers have united for the first and possibly only time in U.S. history to work together, set aside their differences, and withhold American democracy. Because, to be honest, on our own, we'd lose. But together, united, we can win this election. But we need your help. Please, 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 do the right thing and vote for the coalition ticket. Vote Floyd Olson for president. This message is sponsored by Douglas MacArthur. The milkman is here.